Hello, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. Today we are finally going to be testing out the new VISEART Paris Mattes eyeshadow palette. Now they just released this, I believe, on Valentine's Day. So this is made in the US. This has a 36-month shelf life, and this does come in their newer packaging. So it just is this black packaging, and it just flips open like this. There's no mirror, but it does fold all the way back, and then you get these beautiful matte eyeshadows. So this is what the new color story looks like. There's a lot of browns in here. We have a black, we have a really beautiful cream shade, we have a couple of pops of purple and pink as well. Now this is actually my first all matte palette from VISEART. I know a lot of people swear by the neutrals, and I do want to try that at some point, but once I saw this, I just thought it was the most beautiful color story. So let's start by looking at some swatches. I think create two different looks with this one, and then I'll show you a couple of comparisons. Going left to right, we have Aurora, which is a white with a whisper of peach. Point is a cool light beige. Tulle is a light peachy pink. Arabesque is a soft light pink purple. Pirouette is a light creamy beige with a soft pink undertone. Plie is a dusty mauve. Adagio is a buff nude with a hint of lavender. Releve is a dusty purple gray. Ballet is a cool toned light taupe. Soutenu is a caramel warm brown. Fouette is a muted beige taupe. And Tendu is a deep espresso brown. Now I do think Tendu ends up looking more like that black in the palette, but overall, one thing I noticed about this palette is that it does seem to have a bit more of a cooler toned color story. So let me zoom you in. We'll create two different looks. I just think there's only so much you can do with an all matte palette like this, but I do want to create two different looks. And then I want to show you some comparisons, but let's get into it. Now I did set my eyes with my Milani eyeshadow primer. I am trying to use that one up because I have had it for quite a while, and I just set it with a bit of powder. Let's start with this shade right here. I do want to create a more neutral, cool tone brown look on one side, and I want to play with the purples on the other. I'm just buffing this one into the crease. This is of course a perfect crease shade, especially for my skin tone. And I have mentioned this in the past, but I just absolutely love VISEART mattes. I just think they're such a solid formula. They're so easy to work with. They're so blendable. They're one of those matte formulas that just kind of almost blend themselves because they are designed to be a pro brand, but they just blend themselves. I do want to try to deepen it up a little bit, so I'm going to go into this shade right here in the bottom corner. I feel like VISEART is one of those brands where they're known for their eyeshadow palettes, but I don't feel like they release so many. So when they do come out with them, it's always so exciting. So that shade did do a nice job sort of deepening the outer corner. It's just slightly deeper than the first shade I used, and I think that it has almost that more gray tone to it. It really is just a perfect taupe, but I do think this palette overall has a bit of a more cool leaning undertone to it, especially once I swatched it out. I will say once I got this palette in the mail and I opened it up, I thought it was going to be a little bit more pink than it actually is. I still think it's a stunning color story. I just thought from the photos that it was going to be a tiny bit more pink. So very simple and easy, not going too crazy. I do want to deepen that a little bit further though, so I'm going to go into the shade right here. Still just working on that outer corner. And that is definitely adding some depth to everything. The first two shades were very close. One was, I would say, incrementally deeper than the first one, but they really weren't that different. I'm just taking the extra pigment off that brush so I can blend that edge. And then just blending that deeper shade as well, making sure it's well blended. And a matte palette can be such a staple because, you know, you can create these simple all matte looks. You can just add a shade in the crease if you want to, or you can use it to pair with your more shimmery single palettes, or you can use it as a companion for those palettes that don't have just the right mattes. I do think a matte palette is a staple in anyone's collection. I don't think you need a ton of all matte palettes, but I do think a good, solid all matte palette is such a staple. Okay, I do want to do just a little bit of a liner, nothing crazy. I'm just going to go into that shade Tendu right here. It describes this as more of an espresso brown. I genuinely thought it was black, but it is described as more of an espresso brown. And I'm just sort of packing this against that lash line just to give myself a little bit of definition. I'm not really going to wing it out or anything like that. I just know with how watery my eyes are today, it's just going to be ruined in 0.2 seconds if I try to wing it out, so I'm not going to bother. So now we've got that done. I do want to take, this is a Sony G, I think this is the worker brush, the small worker brush, and I'm just going to grab this fair shade right here. And this shade can be perfect for setting your eye primer. It can be perfect for blending the edges, but it can also be perfect for an all-over lid shade like I'm kind of doing here. I just want it to be very, very clean. I want to go back in very lightly with that brush to bring a little bit of that back. All right, and there I just end up with a very soft, all matte, almost kind of smoky eye, but it's just very soft and easy to work with. So let's get into the other side. Sometimes I pop off camera, put on mascara, and then show you the finished look number one, but I think I'm just gonna move right into the second look for this one. So I think for the second look, I wanna start with that pink, that baby pink, and I want to blend this one kind of into the crease. So you can see blended like that, it just gives me a very, very soft wash of light pink. So it's going to sort of provide a nice base and bring everything together, but it's not going to add any intensity. Just a perfect little transition. From there, I want to go into that purple right here. I do think this is pretty, and I want to start using this one to form that outer corner a little bit more. And I love these mattes because the reasons I've already said, they're just so blendable and they take so much of the work out of it for you. They are a bit more of a powdery formula, but that usually means blendability. But what I also love is they have just the right amount of pigmented. They're pigmented, so it doesn't feel like you're not getting anything, but they allow you to build, which for me, that's the important thing. So I was debating on going into this deeper purple, but I kind of want to go into this one. There's just something about it that's calling my name. And I want to start putting this one in the outer corner. Okay, so this one, it really does have like a bit of a pink undertone, but it's kind of purple. Interesting. Okay. That's what was drawing my attention so much. So I feel like while this palette, especially in the promo shots, looks like it's very, very spring, and when you hear Paris mattes, you're thinking, of course, it's a spring palette, but I feel like because it does lean a little bit more cool tone, this is a matte palette that's just going to be appropriate any time of year. I mean, any palette can be used any time of year, but this is a palette that it's not going to steer you wrong any time of year. Like right now, going into this purple, I feel very spring. Over here, I actually felt very fall winter. So I think this palette is going to be great no matter what you want to do with it. Okay, I actually want to go back into that Tendu shade. I want to do the same kind of liner moment on this eye, just because I am working with purples and pinks, and I feel like if you're not careful with those, you can look a little bit ill, and a liner is a really great way to prevent that. I just really love VISEART palettes. I love their new packaging too. I mean, on one hand, I kind of do miss the mirror in their palettes because I find that I would just much rather reach for that than have to have a second mirror to do my makeup. But at the same time, I feel like the new packaging just looks so elegant. Okay, but to complete that look, I do want to go back into that softer pink up here and pack that on the inner portion, just like I did on the first eye, but with this more pinky shade. Okay, that's really pretty. Again, very simple. This eye definitely gives me much more spring. This eye gives me, I mean, neutral every day, if you want to be honest, but it's also any time of year. It's just that beautiful, cool tone browns that I really, really love. So let me pop off camera. I'll pop on some mascara. Then I can zoom you out and show you some comparisons. I don't have a ton for this one, but I'll show you some comparisons anyway and get into my final thoughts. shades. All right, so here are the finished final two looks. We have a neutral, leaning smoky everyday look over here that's a little bit more cool toned. Over here, we have a more spring-esque, very light purple look over here. Just very soft, very spring. And I think both are really pretty. I feel great in both of these looks. So I love how easy and versatile I feel like this palette is. Like I've been saying, I feel like this palette is just one that is the perfect matte palette any time of year. If you want some neutral browns, great, they're here. They're a little bit more cool leaning, so they're just very easy to wear. We also have some purples if you want to go a little bit more spring. We've got a soft pink in here, and this shade down here is a deep espresso brown that almost looks a little black, so it acts as a great liner without being too harsh. So I do feel like, although this is an all matte palette and it does look very basic, I feel like there's a good amount of versatility here. And because it is an all matte palette, like I said, you can really do so many different things. You can create an all matte look, you can go for a one and done, you can pair it with your shimmers. This purple look over here, let me tell you, I am so tempted to reach into my Patrick Ta Major Dimension Eye Illusion Duo. These took a lot of heat when they first came out, but this shade right here is one of my absolute favorites to top over a look like this type of purple look and just give that beautiful little amount of sparkle. I'm tempted to do it, but I'm not going to because this is about the VISEART palette. But something like that could be so simple and easy to do as well. So we do have more peachy tones in here if you do want to go a little warmer, but overall this palette definitely does pull a little bit more on the cool tone side, but I just think it's so beautiful and practical for every day. And it can be used in companion with a lot of these more shimmery single shadows that a lot of us do have. So I think something like this can be such a staple. I did want to share some comparisons to some other all matte palettes that I have. And the one that really came to mind the very most was actually the ColourPop Gone Matte palette. Now, obviously you get a ton more shades in the ColourPop. I do think this is a really good formula for ColourPop. Does it compete with the VISEART? No. Not even close. And one thing I always say about ColourPop is even though they do have some really great formulas, not always, but they do have some really good formulas, the tone is where I feel like they kind of lose me sometimes because these higher end brands just do something a little extra special when it comes to the tones. I feel like drugstore products, a lot of them are just as good, but in the eyeshadow category, I feel like a lot of the reason that the drugstore hasn't caught up is because of the exact tones that some of these other brands can get. So I will pop up those swatches side by side, and you can see that I was able to get a lot of very similar shades. The Gone Matte palette really gives us a lot of warm tone options. It gives us some true neutrals. We do have a purple row. We do have a more pink row as well. So I do think you could create some very similar looks with this one. This is also one that I think is very versatile and great for all year round. Because this one is so large, I feel like there's a lot more redundancies in it and a lot of shades that don't necessarily need to be here, but you can definitely get some very similar shades. So if you already have this one, maybe you can create something very similar. But again, looking at those swatches, they're not identical, and I do think that the VISEART tones are better, and of course the eyeshadow quality is better in general. Now, another all matte palette I wanted to talk about is the Makeup by Mario Master Mattes the Neutrals. Obviously there is no pink or purple in here, but I did want to compare some of these tones because a lot of the tones from the VISEART were reminding me of the Makeup by Mario, because this is very neutral, but it does pull a little bit more cool tone. So I'll pop up those swatches and you can see where I swatched the browns side by side. I was able to get some very similar brown shades. I think the VISEART palette might be a little bit more affordable. I say a little bit, and I do think that I like the VISEART matte formula better. I just think these shades are more creamy, they're a little bit more pigmented, and though I really love this palette, I know some of my shades have a little bit of hard pan, which is something I'm just discovering recently, and that's not something I've ever dealt with from VISEART. So I think if you're deciding between the two, I do recommend the VISEART, but I do think they're both fantastic palettes, and the VISEART of course gives you that little pinky purple twist if that's what you're looking for. I did want to look at some of my other VISEART palettes though, because I know VISEART isn't always known for creating the most unique color stories. They're really just known for these more wearable color stories with a twist. that are still very, very easy and wearable. And sometimes that means they repeat shades quite a bit. So I did want to compare the mattes in the Paris Love Letter to the new Paris Mattes palette. And I would say the Paris Love Letter mattes are definitely lighter and brighter, whereas these are far more neutral, a little bit more muted, just softer in general. So these weren't as similar as I thought. I think these could pair beautifully together though, especially this kind of random pop of purple in the Paris Love Letter palette would pair beautifully with the purple mattes in here, and I think that would be such a gorgeous palette. You can of course pop out your VISEART shadows and rearrange them as you wish, but I do think that these could be really great companion palettes. One thing I forgot to mention is that when they released this all matte palette, they also finally released single shadows. So if you're somebody who is interested in single shadows and you love the VISEART mattes and maybe you just want a couple and you don't want a whole palette, that's a great option too, because I was very, very tempted to order some of those. I also wanted to compare the mattes in the Paris Reverie palette. So this is the spring release from last year. And this was one of my favorite palettes last year. This is one I reached for so often, and I still think it's one of my favorite spring palettes. So I did swatch those mattes side by side as well. I do think we have a lot of very similar shades, a lot of very similar mattes. Again, looking at them directly, I do think they're great companions, but I do think the Paris Reverie is designed so well that you really don't need anything else. And looking at those swatches, that lighter pink, that lighter purple, I was able to get pretty similar from the Paris Reverie, but I do think that these are a little bit deeper, not by much at all, but a little bit. If I had to decide between the two, I do like Paris Reverie. I just think it's one of my absolute favorite palettes from VISEART. But I do think they're both fantastic palettes, and there's definitely a lot of similarities there. I also wanted to quickly compare the mattes from the Lila Lumiere palette that came out, I believe, for Black Friday. Now, this was a limited edition palette from their Archives collection, but they did say that they are bringing this and the Praline Chocolat back. I believe we're just waiting for them to come back in stock. I will let you know in my community tab as soon as I know if they are back in stock, because I know a lot of you were really disappointed to miss out on these. But this is the Lila Lumiere, and the reason I wanted to compare this one is because this one is also very cool leaning, and you can see side by side. I think that these are in a similar color family, and from the swatches a lot of the mattes were quite similar as well, a little bit even more cool tone than the new matte palette, but there was a little bit of similarities there as well. So I mean, with VISEART, it's one of those, they do repeat shadows sometimes, so you can often end up with a lot of the same colors over and over, but there is just something about their formula that is just so incredibly easy to work with. There is something about the curated color stories that I love from VISEART too. So I really love their palettes, and like I said, if you have any of these other palettes that I mentioned, you can probably create some similar looks. I love a good all matte palette. I love that this has a pinky purple twist, and though it is similar to a lot of the things you can probably get from the Gun Matte palette from ColourPop, I do think that the tones in here are better, and of course the formula is a little bit better, so I am just more inclined to reach for this. But I do love it, and I love that it's one that's going to be one I want to reach for all year long, and I still really want to get their original Neutral Mattes palette because I know everybody loves that one. But that is it for me today. Let me know if you picked up this new palette. Are you planning to? Are you still thinking about it? Let me know all of your thoughts down below. I love hearing from you guys so much. If you're new here, I hope you'll consider subscribing before you go. I do upload new videos every single week. Thank you again so very much for watching, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!